Hello, Andrew Whittemore at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And today I'm going to be talking about the rise of exclusionary zoning after World War II and the beginnings of the Open Suburbs movement on the spread of exclusionary zoning after World War II and the recognition of exclusionary zoning as a barrier to upward mobility, especially among recent African American arrivals to American cities. This recognition was the basis of the open suburbs movement in the 1960s. Exclusionary practices spread quickly in the post-war decades, especially after the Supreme Court ruling in Shelley versus Kraemer in 1948. Here, the Supreme Court invalidated the enforcement of racial covenants. Because racial covenants required injunctions by courts, a public action, in other words, the court ruled that the state, the government, was supporting racial discrimination in violation of the 14th Amendment. Between Shelley versus Kraemer and Buchanan versus Worley back in 1917, which overturned racial zoning, communities are left without a direct means of enforcing racial segregation. So they increasingly turn to indirect tactics that just inflate home prices, which has the effect of preserving segregation because of disparities in incomes between racial groups. There's not a comprehensive study, nationwide study, of the spread of exclusionary zoning at this time, of the spread of particular devices, say like exclusive single family zoning, floor area requirements, increases in lot size, and so on. But there are studies of individual counties or metropolitan areas, and these are very telling. For example, one study found that average residential lot sizes in 5 suburban counties of New York City, in New York and New Jersey, found that residential lot size in these counties increased from 9,000 to 19,000 square feet in the short period from 1950 to 1957 as a result of local governments zoning for larger lot sizes. I think some of the largest increases were in Bergen County, New Jersey, Westchester County, New York, both directly bordering New York City. State courts in these years right after World War II, they struck down home cost mandates, which is another thing that jurisdictions were experimenting with, just mandating a minimum cost of new housing. But they upheld minimum floor area requirements. These requirements effectively set minimum costs for new homes, despite such requirements being well in excess of public health standards at the time. Say a requirement for an 1,800 square foot house for a family, as opposed to public health standards, which would have said perhaps 800 to 1,000 square feet. Here are 2 build-outs of single-family detached homes aimed at upper middle class consumers from my hometown of Belmont, Massachusetts, one on the left from the 1920s and the one on the right from the 1950s. The principal difference here is different minimum lot sizes. I would say the houses are also slightly larger, but not too much larger in the development you see on the right. Now, developers were happy, most developers were happy to build on these lot sizes when land costs were still relatively low and household wealth was increasing. Indeed, household wealth never really stopped increasing for this particular segment of the American population. So I can't say developers built this way in the 1950s just because the town of Belmont made them at the behest of fearful homeowners. But whatever mixture of income growth and desire for exclusivity is behind this, what we observe in the post-war decades is more and more accessible urban land reserved for lower and lower numbers of wealthier and wealthier households. Now, localities could not explicitly cite racial bias as a justification for exclusionary practices, per Buchanan versus Worley. But fiscal concerns, environmental quality, community character, also all offer communities less controversial and often genuine reasons for restricting the construction of more affordable housing types. This is essentially what the Supreme Court did in Euclid versus Ambler. Just don't mention race. This is a phenomenon Klingermeyer recognized as heuristics. When controversial and non-controversial reasons for supporting a position exist, the savvy citizen will just not state the controversial reason so as to gain allies, avoid alienation from some in the community, and in this case, avoid legal trouble. Fiscal concerns were especially an off-cited motivation for exclusionary practices. Because of their reliance upon property taxes to fund various improvements, local governments may wish to repel uses that would perceivably entail a high ratio of cost to revenues. And a lot of this was based on stereotypes. The primary target was apartments, which were presumed generally to house lower income families with many children who would burden the school system and police departments. So the tactic you would use would be either prohibiting multifamily construction altogether, or if you do allow some multifamily construction, you could limit the number of bedrooms per apartment. This being understood to hopefully, in the municipality's eyes, limit the number of children who would come and burden schools and police departments. So throughout the past 70 years, since World War II, there's an extensive history of small suburban communities incorporating and then using exclusionary tactics such as these to maintain a healthy fiscal capacity and deliver high quality public goods. 20th century economists actually celebrated this because they theorized this behavior created diverse bundles of public goods, that some municipalities would invest in these goods and appeal to these types of people, and some communities would invest in these goods over here and and appeal to these types of people. But in reality, communities are investing in similar things, schools and police especially, and the quality is just very, very different. It's very good in wealthier communities that exclusively zone. It's not as good in lower income communities that have more diversity in housing types. Now, this is undoubtedly inequitable. It makes attendance to, say, a good quality school contingent on the ability to purchase a home in that town or district. So thus we see how exclusionary zoning can help a municipality hoard its resources, in this case, tax revenues by the wealthy. This is clearly inequitable, and even if there's not kind of a racist intent behind so-called fiscal zoning, the consequences are racially inequitable given dissimilar income levels across different racial groups. And such practices are not necessarily legal. In national, oops, I went forward here, in National Land and Investment Company versus Easttown Township Board of Adjustment, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in 1965 overturned a fiscally motivated zoning ordinance, opining, quote, zoning is a means by which a governmental body can plan for the future. It may not be used to deny the future, to avoid the increased responsibilities and economic burdens which time and natural growth invariably bring. Obviously, some of the language here, the use of natural is misguided. That said, this is denying the future, and I would say even the present reality of who lives and works in many communities is exactly what communities in the US get away with every day. I can't speak to why findings like this are relatively rare. Here are these great maps that Myron Orfield made starting back in the 1990s for his book Metropolitics. He maps various disparities across metropolitan areas, the disparities that exist across jurisdictional boundaries, which has become such a typical story of the American metropolis since World War II. Here, mapping the disparity in tax capacity per household, you can see that some of these towns in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota have 5 times the capacity of those with the lowest capacity. Especially, you can see how in this kind of suburban spread of the city to the east and west, there's a concentration of a great amount of wealth and capacity. This sort of disparity is especially problematic, in a period of cutbacks in state and federal aid. It's simply a disaster for the value for equal opportunity. So given that localities can't really cite racist reasons for exclusionary zoning, but the trends we observe after Shelley versus Kraemer, and other instances certainly would make us suspect that that is a continuing motivation. There's been a lot of research into what exactly is motivating these practices, right? Despite the array of stated, relatively uncontroversial reasons for implementing exclusionary zoning, observers of suburban land use politics have generally doubted that a desire for racial or at least class segregation has disappeared. Constance Perrin approached exclusionary zoning as a cultural anthropologist in the mid-1970s. She especially focused on class and racial prestige, saying exclusionary zoning gave residents of high-priced areas a sense of achievement and superiority over others. She doubted that fiscal concerns were the true motivation for exclusionary practices, pointing out their perpetuation despite increasing evidence that denser housing layouts saved costs in terms of road, sewer, water installation, and maintenance. Similarly, attorney Richard Babcock, writing in the 1960s, also doubted the genuineness of fiscal motives, pointing out that the typical suburbanite spent more on frivolities in a month than any apartment house could add to their tax bill. He summarized, quote, "Apartment development is a symbol of everything they fled in the city. Their conclusion is based on a social judgment." Now, these were both largely qualitative studies. Occasionally, researchers have produced quantitative evidence that belies stated motivations of, say, environmental or fiscal concern. Schmidt and Paulson, about 10 years ago, for example, in a study of open space conservation in New Jersey, they found that local jurisdictions were more likely to acquire land for open space conservation that had existing utility access, right? That land being more likely to be developed for denser, more affordable housing types, right? So the stated motivation is open space conservation, looking at what these localities actually do, not what they say, tells another story, right? In this case, that localities in New Jersey are particularly, not that they're not interested in open space conservation, but that they are in addition interested in discouraging the development of more affordable housing types. In some localities, there is evidence that a desire for racial separation long remained paramount. This is from a study I did in Durham, North Carolina, that shows that the areas where the city council refused to upzone for denser housing, also the areas where it downzoned for lower density housing, that these were significantly whiter than the areas where it upzoned for denser housing, okay? And you don't necessarily see that story emerging with wealth, right? The areas where these exclusive actions, these refused upzonings and these downzonings are happening, are not wealthier. In fact, they're less wealthy than the places where upzonings are occurring, right? So this is telling us that that a desire for racial separation is what is at least in part what is driving some of these exclusionary actions, right? If that was not the case, you would see similar demographics across the types of areas where these different actions are occurring. This was for the years 1945 to 1984. It's interesting that from the mid 1980s, these disparities they disappear. They disappear, and I think in Durham that has a lot to do with who was elected to city council. City council in Durham went from being overwhelmingly white in the 1970s to being split about 50-50 African American, white, and a lot of the white legislators that have sat on city council in Durham in the last 30 years have been fairly progressive. So the socioeconomic segregation resulting from local zoning practice, whatever the exact motivation, it's often immune from court scrutiny because, and there are exceptions you'll learn about in coming weeks, but by and large, courts have let localities zone as they wished, and so have state legislatures. Ambler versus Euclid set the tone here, right? Saying if the validity of the legislative classification for zoning purposes be fairly debatable, and it's debatable in almost every situation, the legislative judgment must be allowed to control. Ambler versus Euclid thus established court deference to local legislatures as almost dogma. So the open suburbs movement. Observing the post-war spread of exclusionary practices, legal scholar Charles Haar in 1953 described regulations including minimum lot sizes, house size rules as, quote, exclusionary planning devices, which are designed to accomplish segregation. But it would take several more years for literature and an advocacy movement to develop around exclusionary zoning per se. The principal figure in the fight against exclusionary zoning was Paul Davidoff, who you probably know as the originator of advocacy planning with his 1965 article on that subject. So exclusionary zoning is what he, in practice, was advocating against from about the time he wrote that article in the mid-1960s up until his death in 1983. Davidoff explained how his movement against exclusionary zoning grew from the frustrations of civil rights advocates with federal programs aimed at expanding housing, job, and educational opportunities within the racial ghettos of American cities. Decades of public investment in central cities have failed to bring industrial jobs back, and the suburbs still accommodated the vast majority of job growth in sectors available to lower income workers. Here's a table that shows the decline of employment in central cities at the same time that employment is growing in suburbs. Previous immigrant groups to American cities, from the Irish to Eastern Europeans to the Chinese, had all experienced discrimination, geographical segregation, but none located in areas where jobs were decreasing in number. African Americans moved to cities for jobs, and then the jobs went to the suburbs, and many African Americans didn't have the means to follow them. So this was really unprecedented in US history, that you would have a group of lower income immigrants coming into the city and not being able to at least access jobs, at least to the degree that this happened to African Americans in the post-war decades. Those who were able to leave racial ghettos found themselves stuck in the same cycle of arriving in a majority white area and then seeing that area shift over to an African American majority, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. But Davidoff did not see the solution to be pumping the money into the cities. He, in your reading you had for today, Davidoff wrote of the, quote, false assumption that because the problems of race and poverty are found in the ghettos, the solutions to these problems must also be found there. Davidoff argued that the most effective weapon against metropolitan class and racial inequity was in expanding locational choice for low and moderate income households. He especially wanted to test exclusionary zoning against the 14th Amendment, outlining such a test case on page 19 of your reading. He was going to look for a jurisdiction with proximity to a large central city containing a substantial number of unemployed or underemployed workers of African American or other minority groups. He was going to look for a place where an employment base that is growing rapidly and contains a number of unfilled jobs requiring unskilled and semi-skilled workers. This place should also have an absence of vacant low and moderate cost units within a reasonable commuting distance of these employment centers. And so a workforce, a disproportionately minority workforce that is compelled to travel long distances in journeying to work, and restrictions requiring, say, new single family housing to be constructed on lots of an acre or more, for prohibitions on multifamily housing. Look for a community, and there were many across the United States that kind of fit in a suburban community that fit into all of these categories, and argue in court that such practices constituted a denial of the equal protection of the laws, contrary to the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Now, as you'll hear about in the next lecture, there were 14th Amendment cases brought against exclusionary zoning in the 1970s. These did not succeed. Davidoff did have other successes, which you will also hear about in the next lecture. So the so-called open suburbs movement is born of the urban crisis of the post-war decades. Most significantly, it expanded the narrative around urban problems to include the white suburbanites who created and maintained ghettos, first by leaving cities and then creating regulatory barriers that ensured they were not followed. Rather than continuing to pathologize African Americans and their neighborhoods, early critics of exclusionary zoning thus problematized white urbanites' behavior, especially their extreme fear of Black people. So extreme that it made them move over and over and over again, and out of some cities almost completely, leaving places like Detroit, Gary, with overwhelmingly Black populations. Davidoff's urban crisis was not a Black crisis, it was all Americans' crisis. Anthony Downs was another major figure in this movement, began his 1973 book, Opening Up the Suburbs, with the point that exclusion from safe and decent housing and job, services, and amenity-rich suburbs was undermining the American value of equal opportunity if it did not undermine the cohesion of the nation altogether. And here, 50 years later, we can see how his words were prescient. Here is an illustration from Hirsch's work called Building the Second Ghetto in Chicago that shows the ghettoization of the generally poor rural African American population that's migrating into American cities from before World War II, but especially during the war. And in the decades right afterwards, up until the 1970s. The means through which the ghetto expanded, how more and more tracts came to be majority and then overwhelmingly Black, was always white flight from areas where covenants were now unenforceable in this pre-war streetcar build-out. The so-called outer city. There's a great book about this by Todd Mischney called Surrogate Suburbs that talks about this process of middle-class African Americans moving out of the ghetto into the kind of further out streetcar build-out of Chicago, precipitating at least some whites to leave initially, prices to drop, poorer African Americans moving in, more whites fleeing, and this process, of course, is hastened by by blockbusters, by the clearance of older Black neighborhoods and renewal programs. This happened again and again and again and again. Michne's book is particularly is about Cleveland. This is just a graphic showing how the Black population, as it's growing enormously in central cities, is stagnant in suburban areas. So the first task of the open suburbs movement is saying what exactly exclusionary zoning is, right? I would say early on, this scholarship was very largely preoccupied with identifying the typical regulatory components of exclusionary zoning and surveying zoning codes and maps across metropolitan regions to understand the distribution of these regulations. Identified regulations included large lot sizes, right? And I showed you that slide a little bit ago of two developments aimed at very similar consumers, but one with the post-war development with much larger lot sizes, right? Typical single family house in a suburban area would have been on a lot that was maybe 50 by 100 feet deep at the smallest, so about 5,000 to 8,000 square feet, versus large lot sizes. We're talking about a quarter acre, that's about 15,000 square feet, quarter acre and up. So large lot zoning, minimum floor area requirements well in excess of public health standards, as I mentioned before, bans on mobile homes, on manufactured homes, prohibitions of anything but single family detached housing. So no row housing, no secondary suites, because that's two families in a dwelling unit. Restrictions on number of bedrooms in multifamily units. Such regulations were especially prevalent in suburban areas. Fairfield County, Connecticut in 1970, 89% of vacant residentially zoned land was reserved for lot sizes of at least an acre. A 1971 study of 4 New Jersey counties found that less than 0.5% of 400,000 acres of vacant residentially zoned land was zoned for multifamily construction, and 83% of the residentially zoned land in these counties were covered by restrictions on the number of bedrooms. Minimum floor area requirements and bans on mobile homes were also nearly universal. Developers, of course, could get zoning changed, and they did, but in a world in which time is money, the developer's world, the legislative process of a zone change has been an effective deterrent for most. And once something is developed with single family detached housing, studies have shown that zoning in these areas hardly ever changes. Such regulations zoning the majority of land for low density single family detached homes effectively preserves the vast majority of a resource, in this case urban accessible land, for the wealthiest segment of the population. Furthermore, given high demand for multifamily housing, rising demand in the 1960s, 1970s, land costs in that very limited area that are zoned for this use basically eliminate the possibility of developers building apartments affordable for low and moderate income households. The supply of land for multifamily is so constrained that that also serves to, that even when you do have, say, multifamily built, that multifamily is going to be more expensive. And certainly there was more to come after this era. For example, design conditions, right, attached to new subdivisions. These are all things that have developed more and more since the 1970s. The open suburbs advocates were, they didn't hold back in their criticism. Jerome Omente, who was a professor of communication and journalism at Rutgers, said that the country's wealthy, quote, have not bought the land, but instead have done the cheap and nasty thing of employing the police power to protect their own interest in the land and to exclude the largest part of the population. Davidoff called exclusionary zoning, quote, Ivy League socialism, excessive government intervention on behalf of not the poor, but the rich. So some very important additional points here. First, these scholars recognize that exclusionary zoning does not look the same everywhere. Davidoff suggested that an exclusionary outcome is one at which zoning pushes housing out of reach of a household earning the national median income. So exclusion in northern New Jersey may look like a ban on attached or multifamily housing, whereas elsewhere, maybe in suburban North Carolina, where I am, it may just look like a requirement that single family homes sit on large lots, right? This is because land costs are generally lower here than they are up in northern New Jersey. Furthermore, and most importantly, Davidoff stressed that some groups, for example, very low income people, elderly people, tend to be inadequately housed everywhere, regardless of whether local zoning represents a constraint that inflates housing costs. So Davidoff argued that tackling exclusionary zoning by itself would not expand opportunities to all Americans, and that the open suburbs movement could only achieve its goals if it also advocated the subsidy of low and moderate income housing in job-rich areas. Davidoff summarized that, quote, since the Industrial Revolution began dumping rural families into big city slums, housing planners have recognized that public subsidy is needed to enable working class families to live decently. The market, in other words, just can't safely, adequately house the entire population. We tried that in the 19th century in the United States, and we all know the conditions that resulted. The higher the land costs, of course, as in urban areas, the harder it is for the market to do so. Downes's solution from his book Opening Up the Suburbs in 1973 that I mentioned before, Downes's solution also paired relaxed density restrictions in suburbs with housing subsidies and mandatory inclusion of low and moderate income housing in new development. So in the next lecture, Professor Getz will talk about the limited success of the open suburbs movement. The 1970s was on the whole a period of revanchism. It was the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the peak of white flight from the cities, whites responding to school integration, and calls for residential integration by voting with their feet and getting out of the cities. Local governments received repeated blessings from the Supreme Court to maintain regulatory barriers that kept out more affordable housing types. Federal initiatives aimed at expanding the supply of low-income housing, such as this is from a pilot project of Operation Breakthrough, which Professor Getz will also talk about. These efforts are discarded before Richard Nixon's reelection in 1972. So between the courts and Nixon's reaction to these HUD programs, local governments in the 1970s get the blessing to use zoning however really they please. I'm happy to take questions. You can email me at awhittem@email.unc.edu. Thank you.